You know, I have a little nostalgia for the GameCube aesthetic despite never owning one myself. Nowadays, I find that I enjoy the look of things that teeter the line between toy and function. Something about the colors and the feel just bring me back to a time when I was younger and I just enjoyed more fun things. And I believe the NYXI Warrior is a great example of that. I mean, look at it. It looks goofy. Everything from how it's molded to the variety in button sizes, how the original, the C-Stick was small, but I made it bigger on the NYXI. It it looks fun. Almost looks like a toy, and I love it for that. I mean, if you were to make this with cheap plastic and put it on a shelf, you'd have a Fisher Price toy. This is a controller that fits in my hands pretty comfortably, but don't get me wrong, this may not be perfect for you. This toes the line between light and heavy controller. It is heavier than a PS4 controller, but lighter than a PS5. And me personally, I haven't had any hand fatigue with it. I've been able to use it for hours at a time with no hand fatigue, and that's great for me. Your results may vary for yourself, but for me, it's been great. But this controller isn't without faults. There's a couple things about it that you may not like about it that I do, or that I just don't really care about, such as the buttons. They are using micro switches. They are not membrane buttons, which a lot of controllers use, such as the Xbox Series controller or the mobile game controller from the Absolute S9. They both use membrane buttons. It's what you're most likely used to from past game controllers, and a lot of newer controllers are switching to micro switches, which as they essentially have more of a click to them. They're more like a mouse switch than anything. And what I mean by that is when you are using the controller on the face buttons, they feel slightly different. Micro switches feel more like a mouse click. So when you press down, you feel the click, whereas with membrane controllers, I'd more so describe it as a bump you're pushing through. But it's really all down to personal preference, but I enjoy it myself. One thing that is very different from the original controller is the D-pad. Instead of a normal D-pad, you have more of the circle pad. Some people like this more. I'm not much of a D-pad expert myself, so for the most part, I find this fine. Another thing about this controller is the gate for the joysticks. You can have the classic octagonal shape if you want to feel like you're playing an original GameCube controller, but if you want to play more modern games with more specific movements, you can switch them so that they are a smooth circle. Like the buttons, it is also nice and clicky. It's not very bumpy at all, and using the circle pad in general is pretty smooth. Another thing about this controller that is pretty modern is it has trigger lock, so that when you press down on the trigger, if you were to lock it, the travel time is very short like the original GameCube. It also has back paddles in case you want extra buttons for that as well, but they can also be taken off and removed and replaced so that the back is nice and flat, so you don't have to have them if you don't want them. It also does use Hall effect sticks, so hopefully this controller shouldn't give in to joystick drift eventually, or at least not nearly as soon as a normal joystick would. And this controller can be played through wired or wireless. It connects through a 2.4 gigahertz dongle. But going back to what I was talking about in the beginning about nostalgia, why and how do I have nostalgia for a console that I never had? Well, when I was younger, I had a friend, and I was probably about 10 or 11 at the time, and I'd always cross the back alley to go to this friend's house, and one of the things that we would do every day is I'd get to go to his room, and he would have his GameCube out, and he had shelves of games. When I still remember this room in my brain, I remember thinking it's big, and it was colorful, and it was filled with a ton of gaming stuff, but honestly, my brain has probably way exaggerated it for what it actually was. Now, that was always something that I admired and wanted to have myself, but this was also a friend that was probably one of the earliest people in my life that I'd consider a friend. But either way, we would play many things like Smash Brothers, Zelda, or one of my favorites in the goofy category, Dance Dance Revolution Mario Brothers. I remember having such a great time for a while until, unfortunately, my friend ended up moving away and I never saw him again. And along with my friend also went my ability to play the GameCube, and I never ended up getting one myself. Things like those memories and me wanting to get away from the all-dark RGB setup that I used to have that still lingers, to be fair, but I have a lot more color in the room now, led me to want to revisit some of those things I loved when I was earlier, and I really wanted a GameCube controller. And that GameCube controller that I really wanted to buy was a Retro Fighters Battler GC. Now this controller is fun and all, and it has the membrane buttons, the face buttons, and overall it's a nice feeling controller. It's very light in comparison to the other one. It feels a bit hollow, a little bit cheaper, but it also is cheaper. It is stuck with octagonal gates, and there is no modern features like trigger locks or back paddles. But overall, it was a nice controller, and I used it a lot. And I love the spice orange. But after a while, it didn't really feel that nostalgia want. Like, it wasn't exactly what I wanted to fill that hunger for, like, the original GameCube controller. And eventually time passed, and I used that controller happily, but then I saw it. And it was like the algorithmic overlords knew what I was thinking, or probably just knew what I was searching on Google. And not only did it look like original Nintendo hardware, to a degree, it also had modern features, and that sounded great to me. Mainly, it was probably the Hall Effect joysticks that made me go, oh, I definitely want to try this one out. Because before this controller, I had no other Hall Effect controllers. And over the past year, since I've bought this controller, all I can say is that I've used it for almost every single game that I have played since then. This literally has become my #1 controller. Before, I was on Xbox controllers for the most part. I'm not a huge fan of PlayStation controllers, not a big fan of the straight joystick layout. When I held this, I was like, I was using it, and I was like, oh, this feels nice. And the Xbox controller is a comfortable controller. I'd still say it is. But something about this one is like the perfect size and weight for me. The buttons feel great, and I love this controller, but it isn't without flaws, and I'll point out a couple to you now. One of the things I would say is a flaw with this controller isn't necessarily the controller itself, but the dongle. This is a fat dongle. This is a big boy, and it does take up some space, especially when you have to connect it to the PC. You have to use the wire as well, so it kind of just hangs there instead of being like a straight rectangle. But the nice thing about it is you can also use this on original Nintendo hardware. You could plug this in and also use the controller wirelessly on that. So I kind of have to forgive it, and plus if they gave me 2 separate dongles, it'd probably be just something that I'd lose eventually as well. Another issue that I would like to point out is that specifically on the right trigger, the ZR button, if I have it locked and I push down hard enough, I can actually move the lock a little bit, and that can become annoying if you were to press down really hard on the trigger. Now, I've never had this actually happen while in practice, but I did see it after stress testing it when I first got it. This doesn't happen on the left trigger, and it may not happen on other people's controllers either. But I thought I should point this out. It has never been an issue for me because I've never ran into it in practice, because you would have to press down really hard on the right trigger, but I thought it should be mentioned. And this may be an issue to some as well, but not really for me. It's not really a complaint, as I don't really notice it unless I look for it, and that's on the face buttons. The font is a little weird, and I think I would have preferred if instead of white, it would have just been indents in the buttons themselves. Similar to how it is done on the Retro Fighters Battler GC. I like the indent a little bit more aesthetically. But other than those two things, I have a hard time finding anything to complain about, especially with what NYXI advertised. It's a great controller. I think it is probably my favorite controller, and it's probably going to continue to be my favorite controller for a while until something better comes along. Maybe NYXI will have something that fills my intrigue, or maybe I want a separate color, because I do love the spice orange, but I do love the purple as well. And with its other modern features like the Hall Effect joysticks, or the trigger lock, or the back paddles, this isn't an elite controller. You were only paying 70 to 80 bucks for this at full price. I think this is a very worthwhile controller if you like the GameCube controller and you don't mind micro switch face buttons. And it definitely fulfilled my need for nostalgia, wanting something from my past that even if I never owned it myself, I find important in my memories. It's nice and colorful, and it fills that like toy aesthetic that I really like. I'm just a big fan of color nowadays, no matter what it is, whether it's art or the channel look or what I'm using to play my games, or even my keyboard, or which is also made by NYXI. It is the Striker, but I won't be making a video about this. I just kind of wanted to show it off. And another thing that I wanted to say, that isn't an issue with the controller, but is actually an issue with me. Since I've bought this controller, I've beaten 0 GameCube games, and I don't know how. I've played a lot of Switch games with this, but none that were specifically attributed to the Nintendo GameCube. So this year, I'll definitely have to do a full playthrough of Wind Waker at some point. Now, you know and I know that I can't tell you if a controller is perfect for you through the screen. All I can say is that I truly enjoyed this controller. Maybe some of the things I've mentioned are not for you. Maybe you don't like certain aspects of the controller. Maybe you don't like that it uses micro switches. Maybe you don't like that it has a circular D-pad. Maybe you're even weary about what I've said about the joystick lock moving a little bit if you press really hard. That's all completely up to you. But overall, this design fills my needs, and I truly do enjoy this controller, and it does bring me back to a time when I can think about playing games with friends when I was young. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, or you want to let me know if you think the controller is terrible, or if you want to let me know that you think the controller might be great, I'll be sure to see and read them. I might even answer them. And thank you for watching. I appreciate it. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye. And with its extra features like the Hall Effect sticks, the Joy-Cock, the original Nintendo hardware. I'm not going to use that.